So hello everybody and welcome to this Climate Farm demo webinar with Harper Adams University. So a bit of background about this project. We've got 1,500 farms across Europe when my slides decide to change. There we are, 1,500 farms across Europe, all sharing how they're adapting to climate change and they're mitigating against their emissions. And the client, Harper Adams, is one of these farms. And a range of areas we're looking at for solutions. And these are the 12 main areas here. But within all these things, we're trying to reach net zero. But the question we get asked time and time again is how can we reach net zero while also maintaining a profitable farming business? So to enlighten us on this topic, we have three excellent speakers. So we've got Richard Hooper, who is director of Harper Adams' Future Farm. Will talk us through how the farm's developed to become more sustainable, and will share the challenges along the way and the solutions they have found. We've got Dr. James McCaughern, senior lecturer in beef production systems at Harper, with his research including greenhouse gas emissions intensity in both beef and dairy systems. And James will be talking us through combining economic efficiency with a low carbon footprint. And last but by no means least, we have Lucy Bates, who is a project manager for the Sustainable Farm Networks Initiative at Harper Adams School of Sustainable Food and Farming. Lucy will share progress within the sustainable farming networks with some case studies and share changes farms have made that are win-wins with no negative consequences and for farming business, and examples where changes have had negative consequences. So if you do have any questions throughout the webinar, there is a question box, a Q&A box down the bottom there. So please just put them in there and we will answer them at the end. But I will let Richard Hooper kick off, explaining a bit more about the work on the Harper Adams Future Farm.
Can you see my?
Yeah, that's all good.
Excellent. So good evening, everybody. I'm Richard Hooper. I am the farm director of the Future Farm here at Harper Adams. Future Farm was set up 3.5 years ago, and our vision was to create a sustainable farming enterprise that had to be ecologically sound, economically viable, and socially responsible. And it had to meet all these requirements whilst aiming for net zero by 2030. I think anybody that knows anything about farming and getting to net zero, 2030 is a particularly ambitious target, especially in the light that we've got a very livestock heavy farm. So it's a particularly challenging target. However, I think it was the right thing to do to set that ambitious target, because if it was 2040, 2050, we perhaps wouldn't have had the foot on the gas to try and make changes quite so quickly. And I think, it's important for someone like Harper to be leading in some of those ideas and putting them into practice and seeing what works, what doesn't work, and what impacts they can have in terms of carbon footprint. So just to give you a bit of background to the Harper farm, we're around about 500 hectares. It sounds like I don't know what we're farming when I say around about 500 hectares. It varies quite considerably from one year to the next, because we own land, we rent land, we contract farmland, and we actually take land on cropping licenses on a yearly basis as well. But we're a diverse farm. We're here to obviously meet the needs of teaching, whether that's undergraduate teaching, postgraduate teaching, or short course teaching. And we're also here to meet the needs of research, again, undergraduate research, postgraduate research, commercially funded trial work, and government funded research. So we need facilities that are really representative of what is out there in the real world, because if we're going to be teaching students, it's got to be real. But we've also got to have facilities that are flexible enough to be able to carry out that research effectively as well. So we currently have a dairy herd of around about 420 cows. These are milked 3 times a day through a rotary parlour. Holsteins at the moment. yielding around about just over 12,000 litres per cow. We calve all year round. We want a flat milk production profile. We're selling our milk through Muller in the Morrison supply chain. And the cows are housed all year round. And again, I'll talk about what we're trying to do to be as efficient as we possibly can with those cows, and what we're trying to do to be more sustainable and reduce our carbon footprint as I go through the slides. We also have 700 Flynn ewes. We used to have a larger flock when we rented as a hill farm locally. We lost that land, so we brought the flock to the campus, and we've reduced our numbers. We're trying to optimize our numbers on how we can fit a lowland sheep enterprise into all the other enterprises that we have at the moment, without having specific land for the sheep. We want them to integrate. We want that golden hoof effect in terms of grazing the arable acres in the winter by growing catch crops, etc., and root crops, and how they can fit in with the grassland management as well with the rest of the farm. Currently, we lamb these between February and May, which is quite a large lambing window, but that is mainly to serve purposes of teaching and research for the undergraduates. If we're running it totally commercially, I suspect we'll be lambing April, May outdoors, and doing that. And we're doing, again, some of the work that we're doing with those ewes in terms of reducing carbon footprint in a minute as well. We run 240 sows, farrow to finish, so we're selling just over 7,000 pigs a year from these animals. Again, all indoors, all at the intensive end of pig production, highly productive, highly efficient herd. And we'll talk again a bit more about that. Beef herd, our beef herd is made up of animals from our dairy herd. So our dairy herd is bred quarter with sex semen for replacement females, and the other 3/4 to beef breeds. In the last few years, it's mainly been Angus and British Blue, and then the finishing we'll hear a lot more about from James, but essentially we're doing some indoor finishing and some outdoor finishing, but I won't steal any James's thunder on that one. We have poultry. Currently, we only have research poultry. We used to have quite a lot of commercial poultry, but currently only research. We then have arable and forage cropping. Most of our cropping doesn't leave the farm. It's there to feed the livestock. The only crop we currently sell is oilseed rape, and we only really grow oilseed rape, again, for teaching, to have it in the mix. We don't really need it as a break crop. It's there to be able to show students and teach students about that. Cropping and environmental research. Again, we do research into anything from sort of house plants, horticultural plants within polytunnels and glasshouse systems, right through to sort of large field plots for research. And some of that research is long-term research, field scale research. We're currently got a project on regen versus traditional agriculture in the same field, in different strips within that field, and looking at the economics and the carbon footprint and the soil within that on a long-term basis. We're only in year 2 of that at the moment, but the idea is to go 10 years plus. We've got controlled traffic farming experiments that are now, I think, 12, 13 years old. We've got things like the hands-free hectare that most people would be aware of, a hands-free farm. We've got a small vineyard as well. It's only a hectare, relatively small, but again, just some sort of way to diversify and see whether we can grow grapes efficiently within our environments this far north. So getting on to our carbon footprint, we've been auditing our carbon prior to 2022, but we're only doing this in sort of individual areas. This is the first full farm footprint was in 2022, and we're about 7,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalents net emissions, which equated to 1.71 kilos of CO2 equivalent emissions per kilo of output. 2023, we actually went up in terms of our net emissions. The big drive when we set up Future Farm was to become as efficient as we possibly can. And we just felt that was the win-win way of lowering our carbon footprint, is by getting better at what we do, which we have succeeded at. You can see that total emissions based on the output has dropped quite considerably. but by producing more, we've had a larger total output from the farm in terms of those net emissions. 2024, again, the intensity has dropped again to 1.41. So we're going in the right direction, but there's still obviously quite a big carbon footprint there on our farming activity. So most of the strategies we've employed in those 3 years have just been to mitigate. So whole farm emissions by gas, you can see that our main output is from methane, and then it's from CO2 and then nitrous oxides. When you actually look, which is the more interesting thing when you're trying to decide what to do about your farm emissions, is looking at the source. And you can see very clearly there that our main areas for concentration need to be on enteric fermentation, on manure management, and on purchased feed. Doesn't mean we ignore the others, but the impact we're going to have on those others is going to be less great than the impact we can have if we can make major reductions in the purchased feed, manure management, and enteric fermentation. So net zero by 2030, is it realistic? Look at our strengths of our business. We've got pretty efficient production across all areas now. We went to 3 times a day milking, which has helped us drop the carbon footprint. We've got quite a lot of solar. You can see on the rooftop solar at the moment. We've got no ground-mounted solar. We've really concentrated on trying to improve the quality of the forage we produce for the dairy. The dairy has the biggest footprint, net footprint of the farm. So we focused on what can we grow as much of the crop as we possibly can on site. We went away from soya in the dairy diets a few years ago. We've tried to grow some protein. We've tried growing soya ourselves, unsuccessfully, sadly. We will no doubt venture into it again when varieties improve for the climate that we're in. But we grow lucerne very effectively. We've got clover in all of our grass lays now, and sort of quite high concentrations of clover in some of those lays to increase the amount of protein. But we're still having to buy in protein to feed the dairy cows as well. So again, the thing we'd like to do is be able to be self-sufficient in that. We've got a very efficient pig unit. And again, the focus on this, even though we're on totally bought in feed because we don't have enough land area to grow what we need, we still use soya in the diets. We've been doing quite a lot of investigation work into lowering protein in diets without affecting feed conversion and growth, and also alternative proteins to soya. And I'll talk about that again in a minute. We use a very low amount of artificial nitrogen compared with your average farm in the UK. I think average is about 90 odd kilos of N per hectare. We're down at 30. And, we're trying to use our slurries far more efficiently. And there are other ways that we want to get more efficient, which again, I'll talk about in a minute. And we've reduced our tillage. And we've tried to go down to minimum soil disturbance. But again, we'll talk about some of the challenges of that as I go through it. So challenges. The big challenge is that meeting net zero by 2030. We can mitigate as much as we like. We can take 10% off here, 20% off there, 30% off here, but we're never going to get to net zero just by mitigation. We've got to do a huge amount more of sequestration as well to get there. And the other challenges are there are things that we can do, and we do a lot of research with methane inhibitors in terms of enteric fermentation. But at the moment, there is no financial benefits from putting these into our diet. So we need a supply chain that recognises low carbon milk, low carbon protein, and low carbon pig protein sold. And again, we've been reducing the protein of soya in pig diets really quite successfully. We can see by just reducing the protein, we've reduced protein quite considerably in some of our final stage finishing rations. And we can see a carbon footprint drop about 20% by doing so without affecting growth or feed conversion. So that's quite significant. Also, replacing the soya with non-land use change soya can drop the footprint considerably. We can drop it even more, up to sort of 40% in some of our rations of a carbon footprint drop by using alternative proteins. So we're looking at sunflowers and rapeseed meals and synthetic amino acids going into the rations. The only issue again is we can effectively get growth and feed conversion, but it comes at a cost compared with a soya-based diet. So whilst we can drop our footprint even further, and it will give us a warm glow knowing we're doing the right thing for the planet, it's not economically viable at present, perhaps, to do this. But we're doing that trial work. We can implement that as and when we know it, if we know it works. And again, our strive within the cropping to get to those sort of well-known sort of regenerative practices, it's been challenging. The last 2 years, we haven't used a plough for 5 years. Last 2 years, we've used the plough quite a lot. And the main reason for this is just the weather has been against us. And I am sure our carbon footprint would have gone up had we stuck to direct drilling and min-till. Because the weather conditions were so appalling, we had to plough, and we've got better yields from doing so. And again, anybody knows anything about carbon footprinting, the yield has a big impact on that. So that is something we're concentrating on. Sorry, I'm getting a call in. Adaptations and mitigation plans. We want to grow more of our feed on farm. Talks about this. We're trying to do this as effectively as we possibly can. We want to improve our efficiency in terms of the usage of the crops that we grow, the genetics. We've got a small trial within the dairy unit of going to pro cross, so putting a 3-way cross in to try and get that hybrid vigor. We suspect we'll see a lowering in milk production, but we hope we'll get a better efficiency of feed converted into milk. We're hoping we'll get better fertility. We're hoping we'll get better lifespan in the dairy herd, which has a big impact on carbon footprint. Our health, we're closed herds and flocks now, so we're minimising that disease risk coming in. And anybody knows the impact of disease and poor health on carbon footprint is quite considerable. We're putting herbal lays. We've got quite a few herbal lays in, and we're trying to improve grazing. And I think James will probably touch on some of the rotational grazing that we're doing with our animals going forward. Low protein diets. There's a lot more work on this, particularly within the pig sector, to see how far we can push it and what we can put as alternatives in without affecting growth. The big one that we've got to get right is increasing soil and plant carbon. That is the only way we're going to get to net zero. The work that has been carried out by others, suggests if you can increase your soil carbon by 0.1% per year, that's sequestering something like 9 tons of carbon per hectare. That is the way we will get to net zero. We can do all the mitigation, but that will be the big one. So it's, can we consistently add more carbon into the soil and into plants, by planting hedges, etc., more hedges around. But it's managing those and not trimming them too regularly, etc. Installing large-scale AD, I put that as a question mark. That's something I think we'd really like to do. Again, to get that green circle going within the farm of the digestate going out onto the fields as a far more readily available nutrients, and then growing our crops which are fed back to the livestock. However, at the moment, there's no real incentives out there in terms of helping to get that funding, and we're talking serious money. We are looking at it, but we're not quite there with that one yet. We're doing a lot of work actually with nutrient stripping as well on our slurries. So again, getting nitrate-rich fractions and phosphate-rich fractions. We've done some trial work. We're now scaling it up to farm scale. And that, again, hopefully will be more readily available nutrients as well, particularly with the phosphates. But we can have better and more strategic application. And if we can dewater that, we can travel on the fields where we wouldn't be able to travel with raw slurry. And again, we can reduce that artificial nitrogen quite considerably, we're hoping. We've also got areas of peat in our estate, and we are looking at the re-wetting of peat, so polludiculture, re-wetting of peat but keep farming it, and looking at the options of what we can grow effectively, whether we can consistently keep that re-wetting. This isn't just flooding fields, this is re-wetting from the bottom up, keeping the top 10 centimetres dry. But anybody who knows anything about sort of heavily cultivated peat soils, it is a huge emitter of carbon dioxide. So it's how can we prevent that happening, and do we crop it, or do we try and restore it and have it as wild wildlife habitats going forward. So I think that's me done, giving you a bit of a flavour of what we are doing. And if there's any questions, I'll try and answer them at the end. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, Richard. And yeah, a reminder, if anyone does have a question, the Q&A box is just at the bottom there. But I will hand over to James to delve a bit deeper into livestock systems.
Can you see that okay?
Yeah, that's all good.
Excellent. I just right, so folks, I'll go for a highlighter color green. My name is Dr. James McCaughern. I'm a senior lecturer here in beef production systems. I tend to work a lot in terms of sustainability, greenhouse gas emissions, historically trace element research, copper toxicity, low protein diets and dairy cattle and beef cattle, sort of anything surrounding nutrition. I mean, I've been given kind of the title of net zero and economic efficiency, and just before I kind of jump into that, just to kind of, the way my head works is, where do emissions come from in our system? And Richard has already alluded to a lot of them there, but if we think about, and the reason it's kind of nutrient cycling is that a carbon footprint is not necessarily all CO2. We may talk about it in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents, but some of the greenhouse gases that are originating from our system, methane being the big one, and then also nitrous oxide, is that's not carbon necessarily emitting from the system. That is a greenhouse gas that has a global warming potential. And when you talk about CO2 equivalents, basically you're equivalating that methane and that nitrous oxide to carbon dioxide. Now, if we think about the feeds that we produce, whether that be legumes, whether it be grasses, whatever those may be, when they carry out photosynthesis, they are complexing CO2 from the atmosphere. Then, for want of a better word, we take that and we feed it to a beef system, for example. Those animals break that down, methane comes out the front. When it comes to certainly our ruminant production species, our sheep, our dairy cows, our beef cattle, as Richard has alluded to, a large proportion of our carbon footprint is this methane component that comes out the front, mostly out the front. A whole variety of ways we can deal with that. As we increase concentrate, so we feed more barley, we feed more cake, we feed more meal, whichever part of the UK and Ireland you are from, by definition, the quantity of methane will go down. Methane is really generated whenever we predominantly digest forages. So there's one thing, first of all, the more concentrate that we feed, the less methane that we will produce. As a rough number, if you were to swap over from an all forage diet to an all concentrate diet, and I mean 90% concentrate with a little bit of fiber for rumen function, you will approximately half the methane output that you would expect from a beef system or from a dairy system, or effectively from a ruminant. So that's the first one. So you get methane coming out the front. Now, we've also got various options for that. We can use methane inhibitors, as Richard has already alluded to, would kind of be the things that come in whenever we've got the consideration of methane. The big one about our feed that we may feed is, generally the rule is that protein, if we import it, has a higher carbon cost than cereals. Again, as Richard has alluded to, the carbon footprint of all food crops will be vastly affected by your yield. So people assume that if crops are homegrown, they will be low carbon. Not necessarily. If you've got a very low yield in relation to whatever the value is for imported, your carbon footprint of whatever you go, and I would include grass in that, can actually be quite high. So yield comes in there, as well as the fertilizer that you may use on a crop. On to the next big one, which is the one that I don't focus on all that much, but when we store, we manage manure, slurries, whatever it may be, we generally get emissions from that. Okay, as soon as the urine and the fecal matter comes out of the animal, we get ammonia. Ammonia, not a greenhouse gas in itself, but when it deposits on soils and nitrous oxide is given off, it's the nitrous oxide component, it's an indirect emission there. And then whenever we store, whether it be farmyard manure or slurries, we do get the release of ammonia under aerobic conditions. So whenever oxygen or air has access to slurry, so whenever we mix slurry, for example, and we reintroduce air, we will increase our ammonia emissions. Nitrous oxide, we can get emissions from that as well. Now, as slurry settles, a crust forms over the top of it, for example, or you have it in a container whereby it runs out of air, you essentially inhibit the release of ammonia from the system, and you swap into methane emissions, which tend to take place in anaerobic environments. And then as slurry separates out and you get the different fractions separating out in the tank, you separate out the feed source from the various microbes that produce methane, and that then lowers your methane emissions. But what you've seen from, certainly from Richard's presentation, is that certainly in housed production systems, and by that I mean housed dairy, housed beef, and housed pigs, the manure management will make up a very large component of the emissions from that livestock system. And then finally, obviously, whenever we apply it, obviously we get nitrous oxide and ammonia emissions. You can vary that depending on your spreading technology and all that there sort of stuff going on. And finally, the bit that's not really within our control, as you would say, in terms of economic efficiency, with what's available at the minute, but we can remove CO2 from the system. A true life cycle assessment specialist would shoot me for using the word sequestration. They would call it net carbon loss, but I think sequestration makes more of the point. You're removing carbon, whether that be in trees, whether that be in hedges. Soil is a much more complex entity. Some soils can store carbon, whereas some very sandy soils can actually release large quantities of carbon. So soil is very much a different kettle of fish when it comes to the behavior of soil and carbon within the soil. Now, there's a variety of generic rules that I would apply to mechanisms whereby you can try, and we have done that, or aim to do that, should I say, when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions and then the alignment with economics. Now, if I just summarize, Richard didn't say much, but we have two beef systems at Harper. We have what I would call a traditional one for this area, all intensive indoor barley, historically barley beef. Obviously, they're cross dairy, as Richard has alluded to. They come out. We would put them into the system, coming from calf rearing at 100 to 140 kilograms, finishing mean about 560 kilograms, steers and heifers, and we're generally finishing around 13 to 15 months, depending on the diet that's fed year on year. Obviously, if we're feeding more cereal-based diet, some years they'll finish slightly sooner, maybe by a month. So in that system, we're talking very high levels of performance, very high levels of live weight gain, and therefore the animal's not actually around for all that long. So if we go back to the diagram that I've just shown you, the principle is if you increase efficiency within a farming system at the same level of resource use, say for the beef system, you reduce the number of days to slaughter, by definition, that animal is alive for a shorter period of time, and therefore you release less emissions associated with that system. Okay, so by definition, as we lower days to slaughter, generally the carbon footprint of the animal goes down because that's an extra week where I haven't had to pay for the maintenance cost of that animal. Okay, so that's the first one. That's one mechanism. So we improve efficiency. Same goes generally for dairy and sheep and things like that. As you increase milk yield, by definition, the carbon footprint of your enterprise goes down. However, where you have breeding enterprises, and by definition, that enterprise is carrying a replacement cost, which off the top of my head, say you have a suckler cow enterprise and you're breeding replacements, that existence of that replacement heifer component within your beef herd is probably worth 2 to 3 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of beef that you produce. Obviously, if your replacements go up, your carbon footprint of that goes up. For the dairy, about a third of the carbon footprint of your milk actually is potentially your replacement enterprise. So say in dairy, for example, if you increase milk yield and down the line that results in a greater replacement rate, by definition, you might actually push your you might actually not get much or no return in terms of the carbon footprint that comes in there. So efficiency is the first one. The other one, I'll give you some actual examples of how we would look at this and interact with this. The other one is to quite simply remove sources of emissions. So for example, say we quite simply take that animal outside. We are not storing any farmyard manure. We're not storing any slurry. So by definition, that carbon footprint component of the system is missing. So we don't have to account for that anymore. Now, in ruminant production systems, say for our beef, it's quite simple. You take them out to a field. Realistically, in intensive dairy systems, that's not going to happen. So you're then into technologies like nutrient stripping, the removal of nitrogen, as Richard has already alluded to. We do quite a bit of work at that. And can we confer stability on that nitrogen to stop it emitting until we apply it? Okay, so you're into removing the sources of emissions there. So I'll show you some actual numbers in terms of our carbon footprint and in terms of our margin over feed as examples for these concepts. And generally, what I've got for you, this one here, we got a highlighter on there. This is the carbon footprint of our, is that going to highlight in yellow? Not quite useful if it did. This is the carbon footprint of our indoor beef production system. Okay, remember back to what I said, steers and heifers, dairy cross, not wonderful genetics, but it'll do. It'll make it into carcass specs. Inside, fast growth rate, as fast as possible, hit our market weight. The principal component there is I've got a low number of days to slaughter. And you can see for the year where I've actually used our performance numbers, 1.3 kilograms per day in that indoor system, and our total carbon footprint, CO2 equivalents per kilogram of dead weight, is 9.5 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of beef produced. The average for the beef sector is about 26. For dairy beef, it's about 22. And for suckler beef, it's about 28. So you can see that our carbon footprint, and I'll show the margin over feed in a minute, in terms of economics that goes with that, our margin over our carbon footprint is considerably less than the industry would be. Sorry, the mean for the industry would be. And the reason for that under this scenario is that lower number of days to slaughter and the dilution down of all of the emissions that we have, essentially. Now, what you can see is that obviously corresponding with Richard's presentation, enteric fermentation, so methane is the big one. This year, that year in question, we were feeding a forage-based diet. So you can see that methane prediction is incredibly high that year. This year, where forage is short and they're feeding a concentrate-based diet, that'll be about half. So you can see our carbon footprint actually swings up and down just based on what type of diet that we're feeding at any time. But what you can also see is that manure management and imported feed make up quite a large component. So over the last few years, we've been trying various things to try and improve this. Now, obviously, we can't take days to slaughter any lower because we hit really the biological capacity of the animals in terms of growth rate. But B, once we come up against 12 months, we come up against the problem of being able to classify those animals as prime beef. So the only real option for improvement that I can see in our indoor system, instead of putting them in a new shed and harvesting the methane off and using it to, I don't know, create biomethane or heat a greenhouse or something, the only sort of reasonable way is to look at mechanisms by which we can reduce our emissions from farmyard manure. So, given that we have a soil type that will allow us to have animals outside for a large period of time, including the winter, we've kind of come to this competing all outdoor beef production system. And the generic principle is, sorry, that's my time up, so I am nearly finished, Chair. So we have native cross animals. We have more than Aberdeen Angus. We have British Shorthorn as well. We calve those in the autumn. And then in the spring, we take those animals outside. We put them through rotational grazing. We put them through outwintering. At the minute, we're even feeding them dairy cow refusals. And what we are trying to do is by removing that manure management component, obviously we can accept a lower growth rate, but what is the capacity in an all outdoor system in terms of emissions? And that's what I've really got to the right of this, folks. So this is really us doing a sensitivity analysis. So what would our lifetime growth rate have to be in an outdoor system to have those animals with a comparable carbon footprint to the indoor system? I would actually say that the 0.6 kilograms per day at 13.12 would still put us in the very top of the industry, let alone these other higher growth rates to the right. But you can see that with high growth rates, we can get certainly equivalent to the carbon footprint of an indoor system. Going by what Matt's told me this week, our average is about 1 kilogram a day. So for the outdoor system where we're sat at the minute is basically in there at this moment in time. Okay, so that's the generic principles. Just before we finish off, these are the actual numbers and everything that goes into that. So you can see aligning that in terms of economics. Now, this is going back a little while because the beef price was sat around £5 a kilogram at that point in time. You can see our average age at slaughter was about 13 to 14 months. Our lifetime live weight gain, 1.3. And our margin over feed, which doesn't include overhead costs, so that would be the one caveat that I put there, but our margin over feed, so pounds of carcass out versus feed in, was sitting about £2.50 for every kilogram that animal put on. Okay, and you can see that actually, bear in mind the outdoor system doesn't have to deal with the same overhead costs. You can see that actually we would have to get up close to the 1 kilogram per day to get comparable level of output on the outdoor system. Okay. So the one thing I would probably conclude with is that the fact you can't really run away from in all of this when it comes to growing animals is that a smaller animal will emit a lower quantity of carbon. So for example, if we were to buy store cattle at 300 kilograms of live weight, we will not capture the most efficient component of their production cycle. And by definition, our carbon footprint would actually be quite a lot higher. The other thing that we haven't really considered here is actually that in our outdoor system, as Richard has alluded to, the carbon removal or sequestration potential is so much higher on the right side of this equation, because generally if we're grazing grassland, we have access to the grassland, the hedges, the soil, and the potential sources of net removal from it. I think that's me, Chair.
Well, thank you very much for that, James. And I shall hand straight over to Lucy.
Hi there. Now let me see. Replace current one. Set about it with this one. Okay. Is that showing for you now?
Yeah, there we are.
Yeah, that's good. Got
The
the right
fancy
thing.
graphics are up. That's all good.
Yeah, all good. Showing it the right way around.
Yeah.
Right, lovely. Hi there, people. My name's Lucy Bates. So I work at Harper Adams also in the School of Sustainable Food and Farming. And my main job within that is looking after the Sustainable Farm Networks initiative, which we're for just over 18 months into. And this was set up following a 2022 report, which was nationally involved, a lot of stakeholders, lots of different individuals and organisations from all across food and farming sector contributed to a report called The Application of Science to Realise the Potential of the Agricultural Transition. And one of the recommendations of this report was that demonstration farm networks should be better coordinated. There's lots of different organisations and individuals across the country working to try out and demonstrate new practices, ways of doing things to make farming more sustainable, and there should be better communication between them. So Harper Adams and the SSFF stepped up and are hosting the initiative that I was brought in to set about. And this is kind of the real action we're undertaking and why we're doing it, which is to build a socially and environmentally resilient and regenerative food system in a net zero landscape. So very much at that landscape scale. And we're looking at connecting diverse demo farm networks to share experiences, findings, and best practice. So really, that net zero is important, but it's at landscape scale and it's part of the bigger landscape. So the way this is working is really making sure we're looking at the integrated sustainability parameters. And I'm sure all of you are aware on conversation about net zeros, it's one part of a big picture. And so all along we've had this kind of context of it being part of multiple sustainability parameters picture. And of course, that those diverse demonstration farm networks are coming from all sorts of different places. There's lots of different reasons why groupings have come together to try stuff out and share the findings. And I'm happy to say that Innovation for Agriculture Climate Farm Demo is one of those networks, one of 36 who are now member networks of the SFN. We meet quarterly, the network stewards meet quarterly, and we look at various different activities and opportunities and really kind of find where there is common ground and where there are gaps. And at the moment, we've got a this nice picture is an example of the spread. Really, we cover all the nations of the UK, and this is not even all of them. This is 29 out of the 36 member networks on a map. So 1,411 points of demonstration. This map doesn't look like there's 1,400 odd dots on it, and that's because some farms are members of multiple networks. So that's something that the SFN offers to those stewards, is finding out where they've got demonstration farmers in common with each other. This is kind of really now moving into the nitty-gritty of it, which is that we have this real spread represented. So we've got the nations of the UK over here and the sectors up here. And I think the network sustainability focus areas is really interesting because there's a temptation to circle the ones that I have and say these are what we're looking at as net zero, which is the majority, to be fair. But I think once we actually start drilling down into the nature of demonstration and the nature of farm system change, we find that biodiversity and healthy communities are also very much part of the picture. And it's a trick missed not to be picking up on some of the wins there. I was gonna, oh, sorry, I lost her. Oh, so we've got I've got a few slides from, sorry, let me just see where I am with, yeah, good. Okay, I've brought in some of the picture from Arc Zero, which is another one of our demonstration farm networks. And John Gilliland, who is a farmer involved in that, he also chairs our steering group. And just sort of putting into the real forefront that net zero is not just about zero emissions, it's about the balance of sequestration with emission. So kind of that whole picture, that whole system story is really key. And I'm just going to look at 3 examples. Iory said, can you tell us some things that people are doing to move in the right direction? I was like, yeah, we can pick up some examples from across the networks. And there's 3 here. The one in most detail I'm going to go into, because there's some really useful work in the background of this network, is the ArcZero experience so far. Some of you may have come across this. It's been really important in Northern Ireland. There's 7 farms, but it was one of the inspirations for the Soil Nutrient Health Scheme, which has resulted in a carbon stock taking across the land in Northern Ireland, really groundbreaking. I'm going to take an example from Demonstration Farm Network that I look after for M&S, their Farm of the Future programme, and also a supply chain demonstration farm, OSI, at Bromgain Farms. So the ArcZero project took 7 farmers, geographically dispersed across Northern Ireland, so different soil types, all with livestock, which the majority of Northern Ireland is. I've learned on going to visit it recently. Is that not the case, James? But looking at different systems and working together really to measure in order to manage their carbon. So it was a real effort and exercise in baselining and benchmarking, making a really conscientious starting point. And they looked at emissions, carbon stocks in soil, carbon stocks in trees, the net carbon position as a result of that sequestration and emission, and then what we can do with that, what farmers can do with that informed information. There are other public goods as well, again, bringing back in that integrated sustainability parameters aspect of net zero. So this was the total carbon stocks in the soil. This was really important finding, just the amount of carbon that's being managed by the farms, that the majority of that is in the soil, that's below ground rather than above ground. And we can target an increase there. I think as Richard said, that's where the win is, that's really where the potential lies for agriculture. In addition, you know, we can cycle carbon as much as we will, but in terms of actually taking it back down, it's going to be in that soil sequestration. Question here, will that be recognised in the greenhouse gas inventory in scope 3? How do we place that in the actual accounting story? And this really is the kind of hub for me. This is the most useful thing that ArcZero have found out. And it's really an evaluation of the win-wins, which we talk about a lot. There's many good things we can do here. We've got the win-wins over here. We've got the Dairy Economic Breeding Index. We've got liming, we've got reduced age of finishing. These are things that are economic wins for the farm, as well as reducing greenhouse gas emissions or increasing sequestration. But here we have a crossover point where actually there are actions which are impactful in terms of greenhouse gas reduction or a sequestration improvement, but they're going to cost. There's going to be a cost to them. And I'd kind of go as far as to say possibly not negative consequences, isn't even necessarily the way of phrasing this, but a cost, a positive consequence, but with a cost. And I guess this really is my response to the title of this webinar is probably an observation that thriving farms are more likely to reach net zero, if anything. I think we several of the measures that are being enacted on farm Harper are mentioned here, and I think we do have that feed additives. We have that, as Richard pointed out, there's a cost. There's a win in terms of carbon, but there's a cost in terms of economics. So, oh, there we go. We had moving slides. And then this is just a little snapshot of, given the information that we did have there, given the exercise and the activities of the ArcZero programme, which involved a lot of peer-to-peer knowledge exchange, a lot of communication, a lot of conversation, a lot of farm visits, a lot of practice in how data can be turned into information, can be turned into knowledge, and can be turned into action. These were the findings. These were the actual reduction in greenhouse gases across these 5 businesses over the course of the 2 years between 21 and 23, which is great, isn't it? the things that we found, the things that well, not we, I wasn't there, the things that were found, some of the really determining factors around success in these was health of livestock, which there are aspects of control around, and the weather, which there aren't. And we can look at the final report here. I'm happy to share these slides with you, Iory, and this will be a link available through that if that's useful to anybody. I'm going to move on then from Arc Zero to the M&S Future Farm programme. So I look after 7 farm, the communication between and from 7 farms in the M&S Future Farm programme. And here we are up at the top of a very top of a pyramid of how Marks and Spencers are looking at reducing their scope 3 emissions, improving their sustainability story, and supporting farmers towards making changes that will have a positive environmental as well as social and economic effect. And one of the guys that lives in Gloucestershire, so this is Austin Russell. He's also a Muller supplier, but in the M&S dairy pool, so with a slightly different subsection of the same pool. And these are just some of the things that he's that they've done on their farm, him and his wife Eloise, that have had positive outcomes. They're complicated. It's a whole system. They have aspirations for more. But as one of 1,300 Muller producers, there's real potential here for his actions and the monitoring and the understanding of how they work, both in terms of the benefits, but also where there's the cost to influence other farms across the supply chain. I'm not going to read these out to you because you are grown-ups and you can read, but there are various different aspects there of herd management, land management, feed management that are going to deliver changes in Austin's carbon net zero position, and that over the course of the project that the SSFF is running with Marks and Spencers will be accounted for. We've done a baseline and we'll be revisiting that. We'll be revisiting that as we move towards 2030, which is the end of the project. This is another example I kind of wanted to bring to you, and this is quite an intensive demonstration farm in that it's run primarily as a demonstration farm. So Brongain Farms, OSI, and the support of McDonald's UK and Ireland, who they're an important supplier to, and really through quite intensive, really, observation of the impacts and the costs and the benefits. They've pinpointed and evidenced some of the ways in which a farm a model farm can move in a model setting towards net zero. And they've got genetics, land management, resource use, herd health and welfare, nutrition. And I think what's clear here is these are the same things recurring. We're hearing this over and over again. We do know what the actions are that take us in the direction of a net zero position, but the real challenge is how that actually happens, one foot in front of the other on a farm whilst it remains thriving. And I would say thriving is a really good way of describing the best possible starting point for any farm business that's moving in the direction of net zero. So really, there's no one solution or silver bullet. We see recurring themes. So I think the sharing of notes, which is what the Sustainable Farm Networks is built for, is important. And the consideration of context is also important. I think what we see across demonstration farm networks is that those who are involved and who are up for checking, and those who are involved and up for it and into it, and in that sort of top percentage, they're probably already doing pretty well. But I think that's an opportunity. That's a great thing, because even the best can get better. And actually, once those win-wins have been used up, and the low-hanging fruit's been taken, what a lot of demonstration farms struggle with is how you then refine that and keep getting better and go the extra mile. I think James described how already the Harper herd is really above industry. It's above excellent in terms of industry averages, but still we strive to get better. And the fact, I think, that it's not all win-wins, understanding there are actions that have costs, but that's where the importance of really costing those costs and describing those benefits to policy and supply chain, so that the risk and the cost can be shared and businesses can remain thriving and are not expected to shoulder the entire burden of changes that actually are critical for sustainability, not just economic, but also social and environmental. And yeah, just my observation, thriving farms are actually the best placed to reach net zero. So I'm going to call it at that point, but I'm easy to find if there's any more questions or anyone would like more information about sustainable farm networks.
Lucy, thank you. That was a perfect analysis of how farms can reach net zero and thrive. Good news that we do have a couple of minutes for questions. And Lucy, we'll actually start with you on this one. Would you look at land use change on the least productive 5% of land that is farmed?
I'm not sure that is for me. I think
Oh
that
yeah,
might be for...
it is for probably Richard Hooper, but then I thought I might get your analysis on that question before I moved along.
Would I look for 5%? Would I look for land use? I think it would very much depend on the context. It would depend on the landscape that farm was seated within. It would depend on the public goods or other benefits that could be delivered from land use change. It would depend on the land use change. So there's not a blanket answer to that for me. I think Richard could give an answer from the perspective of the Harper farm. But I certainly wouldn't go as far as to say that 5% was the right number for every farm, or that that was a universal truth. So I'm going to hand over to Richard for a more specific response.
Straight for the Harper farm.
I think, yeah, Lucy's covered it really, really well there. It's very dependent on your own farming system. At Harper, we've identified areas historically that are low production, and we've got land in SFI agreements, and historically had them in countryside stewardship agreements, where that land is better suited to alternative uses. That being said, we're still investigating other ways of managing land that we perhaps historically haven't done. Like I say, what percentage that needs to be on any particular farm, really does depend on your goals and your aims for your farm. And ultimately, I think you've got to go back to our vision that you've got to do things that are ecologically sound, but they have also got to be financially sustainable. At the end of the day, we are businesses, and those businesses have got to be able to thrive, which we've heard a lot about tonight. So it's getting that balance right, and that will really, really vary from one farm to the next.
Cool, thank you very much. And we also have a question from Humble. Hi, excellent presentation on net zero and on-farm challenges. Good work. Question for Richard. What are your thoughts on using biochar/hydrochar to help increase soil carbon and its contribution in achieving net zero farm?
Yeah, I mean, good question, because it's exactly what we've got projects on that at the moment, looking at biochar incorporated into the soil. We haven't got a lot in terms of results as yet, but it's one of those. It's got potential. We just need to actually quantify that potential and refine the quantities, etc., that need to go into soil to get the greatest benefits. And that will take time, but it's another one of those tools that is looking quite exciting for agriculture. In the same way, we've been looking at this sort of spreading weathered basalt as well as a way of getting carbon into the soil as well, and through getting carbonates through the weathering of it. And there's going to be lots of things that are ideas that need to be carried out, that applied research in the real world. We can get a theory, but we need to actually get that and done in different areas of the country. And I think that's the great thing about having your climate farm demo. It's a great thing about having sustainable farm networks, so that we can carry this out across the whole of the UK, and we can all feed back into those networks, and we can all learn from those networks. So I think it's it brings in everything we've said tonight absolutely really, really well.
Yeah, well, that's a perfect note on which to end, because sadly we are out of time. But yeah, we should keep sharing ideas and maximizing the current efficiency of our operations. And but we'll have to keep looking for solutions as we go forward, involving sustainable farming networks and climate farm demo networks as part of that. So Thank you very much to our three speakers for sharing all your worldly insights. And yeah, we have lots more Climate Farm demo webinars and demo events coming up. So look on the Innovation for Agriculture website for those. But yeah, we shall hopefully see you soon. And thanks again to our three speakers.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.